Hello and welcome to the Sci 333E Psychology of Disaster and Climate Change course at the University of Maine at Augusta. This is the mini lecture video for Module 5, Differential Impacts, Vulnerability and Preparedness by Population, Location, and Demographic Factors of the Fall 2017 course. In this module, you will see two different major topics. The first being the disparities according to country or region of the world, and the second topic is specifically looking at vulnerable populations. And here I am calling out women, children, and elderly as parts of the population. Now in topic 1, country and region disparities, we have two different readings. The first is a chapter that I wrote called Psychological Impact of Climate Change on Marginalized Groups. It was published in Volume 2, Societal and Global Issues from the Social Issues in Living Color series that was published last year. And this reading can also be used as kind of my lecture on this topic. It covers all of the major points that really come to my mind when I'm talking about different populations in terms of vulnerability, in terms of marginalized status, in terms of race and ethnicity, in terms of marginalization within the country that they live in or within the global scale. This reading covers a good deal of the research that I have experienced, but particularly I try to hold on to the stories of people or the countries where I've been, as well as a lot of the different research that has been going on about how different racial and ethnic groups experience climate change. Some of these things are, due to the differential vulnerability that we've talked about in this class before. Some people have more power in a population than others do. That means that some people have less power, less access to resources, and less ability to prepare for and adapt to climate change. This includes the differential ability to prepare for and adapt to disasters, one-time disasters or multi-time disasters that occur, as we talked about at the beginning of the semester, but then also these longer-term changes that we see with the changing climate. So for example, if we know that a certain population, even within a country, even within, say, the United States, is very poor, is very resource poor, and does not have access to high-quality building materials or codes or, the preparedness sorts of planning activities and items that wealthier populations within our country are going to have access to, they're going to have a more difficult time and probably a much higher rate of death and destruction when a disaster occurs, such as a hurricane or something of that like. We also see that there is a lesser ability for populations to retreat before a storm. If there's an evacuation that is called, they may not have anywhere to go or have the funds to be able to leave. We also see vulnerable populations who just basically will lack the resources in order to rebuild after a disaster occurs. When we start looking at the longer term changes with climate change, so things such as sea level rise, the increased disasters, poorer air quality, poorer soil quality, and the ability to grow plants and food and maintain livelihood and well-being, again, this is going to differentially impact populations that are poorer, that are resource poor, that experience discrimination or oppression within their country. And so even within a relatively wealthy nation like the United States, we're going to see that some communities are just more vulnerable due to these issues of discrimination. This is discrimination against the poor, so lesser access to resources among poor people, but also discrimination due to ethnicity, minority status, and whatnot. We know that these are ongoing issues within our country as well as other places around the world. Now, in addition to this, we also have regional disparities in the sense that some countries just have lesser access to resources. One of the points that I make in this article, but that I talk about a lot, is that very poor countries like Tuvalu, like the Maldives, like the Marshall Islands, like Kiribati, these are all low-lying island nations that are already experiencing the brunt of sea level rise and the impact on their land, on around their shores, erosion of their communities. That is, number one, just happenstance that they are experiencing those things. It just happens to fall within those communities because of the nature of climate change. It's just inherently unfair. But number two, these countries don't have the capacity to build up their shores, to implement technology in ways that would be able to save their islands. Manhattan is also a low-lying island, and we have seen Manhattan flooding, for example, with Superstorm Sandy that came through a number of years ago. But Manhattan has the capacity to prepare to rebuild after a storm like that passes through, whereas low-lying island nations in extremely poor regions of the world and very poor countries are just not going to have that same capacity. Now, going back to the issue with the happenstance of where climate change impacts people, we see this kind of dual-fold long-term historical issue. Number one, regions of the world where the climate is just more vulnerable. So, for example, where they have a very dry season and then a very wet season, oftentimes because the population is spending so much resources and efforts in terms of just navigating these systems, and they've had many hundreds or thousands of years to figure out how to navigate these natural systems, so they do it pretty well. But because so much of their energy as a society is kind of worked into these very variable natural systems, that means that usually lesser resources were put into, for example, industrialization or colonization, other things that we saw with Western Europe and with the United States and a few other places around the world that are very wealthy at this time. So part of it is just happenstance of where people happen to live in terms of how much resources that they have. Part of it is the very direct impact of long-term colonization and imperialism going back hundreds of years. And some of it is actually due to very racist and classist, like discrimination against the poor, that we see within the country but also around the world. The Pinderhughes chapter is looking at the impact of race on environmental quality. This chapter was written about 20 years ago now, but the information holds true even today. What we see is that ethnic minority communities, even in the United States, have a much higher rate of exposure to poor environmental quality issues. And again, there's an argument to be made that some of that is just happenstance of where people happen to live. In a place like the United States, that is just not the case. People in ethnic and racial minorities have been shunted into communities where the land has poorer quality, where corporations will be dumping toxic waste, where factories will be built, where there's going to be a lot of hazardous pollution happening. Part of this has to do with just the ability of some populations, for example, wealthier white communities, to say, not in my backyard. They have the political capacity, the economic capacity, and the social resources in order to block those sorts of pollutive efforts within their communities. However, minority communities often do not have that same capacity. They don't have the political resources, they don't have the social resources, they don't have the economic resources. And so when there is pollution that is going to occur from factory runoff or from whatever, it's going to happen in poorer communities. Pinderhughes documents this very well, which is it's a heartbreaking chapter if you haven't read it already, but it's very important for us to understand. We can see these things happening now in the United States. There's been a lot of media coverage over the past couple of years about, for example, the oil pipelines in the Dakotas. They were not crossing rivers upstream of wealthy white communities or major white towns. They instead were redirected to be crossing streams and rivers near native reservations. Native populations in the United States, in addition to dealing with many hundreds of years of genocide at this point, also live in extremely poor conditions based on these hundreds of years of policies accumulating to reach this cumulative effect of just environmental degradation, very few resources in terms of human capacity, and I mean this in terms of like health and wealth, food access, things like that. And so we see these really impoverished communities that don't have the political clout in order to say no to these major corporations that are also giving money to political parties and whatnot, and have the capacity within the legal system in order to push their way through. We see in some Native communities even things like nuclear power, which is oftentimes touted as a good response to climate change because it's a zero emission sort of power. It's not without its downfalls. So uranium mining tends to happen on Native lands or in lands nearby poor communities, and that means that the mines don't necessarily follow through with the same type of safety that you might see if it were near a wealthier community. And so we have higher rates of cancer because of uranium dust just being left all over the place. We see this also with very poor white communities in the Appalachia region. Down south, Appalachia is a region that is oftentimes overlooked in terms of the health and quality and political and social capital of the very poor white communities because they're mountain folks, and they're often overlooked in a very similar way that we see people of color overlooked within our country. This isn't just the case in the United States. This is the case in a lot of different places in the world. Minority populations often have a much more difficult time because they have a much higher exposure rate to pollutants, environmental pollutants, and man-made pollutants from these things. We also see countries that have lesser political capital will have corporations that, for example, wouldn't be able to manufacture goods or harvest resources here in the United States because of our laws that protect people. Instead, they will go to third world nations where there are not laws in place to protect people, and so the very poor people in these very poor countries are exposed to the sorts of environmental degradation and human degradation that we won't have here due to our human rights laws. So it's devastating, and it doesn't come from nowhere. The issues that we see with climate change are the new iteration of these same sorts of environmental justice issues that we have seen across the world and across our country for hundreds of years already. And it's very important to understand that there is an interplay between happenstance of where the hurricanes just happen to hit, happenstance of where the sea level rise just happens to be worse, and different things like that, and a very ongoing concerted effort to accrue wealth in certain pockets while taking wealth from other pockets of the world. And this exacerbates the problems for very vulnerable populations, and again within a country, but also when we're looking across countries. The second module that we have is looking specifically at women, children, and the elderly. And I put those three groups together because very often what we see, still in the United States, although we are seeing population shifts, but it's happening slowly, but definitely around the world, women are most likely to be the ones who are in charge of child rearing, of passing on culture to the next generation, and also are the ones who are most likely to be in charge of taking care of elderly relatives. And so in addition to any discrimination or oppression that women might receive on their own right in any given country or community or culture, we also see there's this additional caretaking role. And the three of these things together, the oppression or discrimination that might exist in different countries with lack of access to education or wealth or economic opportunities or working opportunities, in addition to the additional responsibility and cost and time cost as well of taking care of children and taking care of elderly mean that women have a special place of vulnerability. They might be experiencing some sort of discrimination or lack of access to opportunities and ability to prepare for disasters and prepare for climate change. But in addition, they're going to have this special responsibility to care for children and elderly and prepare them for disaster and prepare them for climate change. When we see disasters happening around the world, a lot of times we will see higher rates of death among women, children, and elderly than we'll see among male populations. And the reason for that is in some times going to be the better opportunities, the better capacities and resources that men have within a society versus what women have in a society. We see stories of women staying behind when a disaster is striking because they're trying to evacuate their children or they're trying to evacuate their elderly relatives that they are responsible for, and then they all die. So we, in these two articles, first I have UNICEF, which is a really great article that kind of goes into all of the different types of vulnerability that we see with children around the world, particularly regarding the short-term and long-term impacts of climate change, but also the UN WomenWatch. This looks at women in climate change. It's a much shorter fact sheet, actually, and you'll see that there's a lot of crossover with the vulnerability that we see with children. And so I would encourage you to look at these a little bit more deeply in order to understand that even though we oftentimes think of, women and children first, and there being this kind of privileged space for women and children to be safer within a community, a lot of times just because of basic economic opportunities that are allowed to women or children and rights that are offered to them, this is often not the case, and they're in fact much more vulnerable than other portions of the population. Now, our two activities for this week are first the reading reflection. I want you to answer the following questions. Describe at least 5 ways in which minorities, children, and women are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and cite appropriately. Even if you are citing my chapter, please put, my chapter's heading and everything. Why are some populations more vulnerable than others? So in addition to describing what are these differences, I want you to describe some of the different reasons that can create this differential impact, and what are your thoughts about how we can reduce this? Some of this is addressed in some of the readings, but you might want to do a little digging or thinking on your own in order to come up with some good, solid thoughts about how we can shift our society so that we are able to have higher levels of protection and preparedness for all populations, including, and I would say especially, populations that are vulnerable anyway within a society. The second activity is applying the terminology. I have an article from a couple of years ago talking about how climate change was perhaps one of the major factors that contributed to the destabilization of the Syrian regime, and how that has indirectly led, at least in part, to the refugee crisis that we have been seeing with Syria over the past couple of years. A lot of times we've been talking about Syrian refugees just as though they came out of nowhere and that this country just fell apart, but there were experiences of drought and physical resource and environmental destabilization, which then precipitated the governmental and social and political destabilization that we saw. We can anticipate seeing increases in our experience of political and governmental destabilization as our access to regular and stable resources begins to diminish because of climate change. And so please read through that. Give me your thoughts on how the world can and should respond to populations that are made vulnerable by climate change, and especially in terms of these political issues that may seem as though they have nothing to do with climate change, but in fact we do see that they are exacerbated in some way by climate change. So once again, put some thought toward that. Let me know if you have any questions. You will also notice on Blackboard, and I've sent out an announcement about this as well, that I have shifted the deadline for this module back to December 3rd. From what I've been hearing from some of the students, there's still a little bit of difficulty recovering after the windstorm and the power outage and internet outage that we had. And so I wanted to make sure, especially as we're in the run-up to the end of the semester, that everybody has ample time. I do want to give you a note of caution, though, not to take too much time on this and then not get to work on the very last module until the very end of the semester, because the deadline that I've set for that is the drop dead date. It's the very last day of the semester at this point. So just make sure that you have time to complete Module 6 as well as you're closing this one up. Don't just procrastinate for the sake of procrastinating. As always, let me know if you have any questions. I look forward to hearing from you.